Hello and welcome to the Westcity Church podcast. If you'd like to get to know us more, find us at westcitychurch.com.au. We really hope that you're encouraged by today's message.
I was little, from childhood to teenage years and even today. During times where I felt hurt, grief, or loneliness, I would listen to music to self-soothe and even sing to myself. Not just any song, but usually songs that were written or could have been written from the point of view of God. And that was how I commune with him, how I'd share my heart and mind and receive his comfort. From Switchfoot to Coldplay to the Prince of Egypt soundtrack. Bob Dylan was one of the greatest songwriters in history. My favorite song of his is Make You Feel My Love. Most sources will tell you that Bob Dylan wrote this song from the perspective of Jesus Christ. I cried when I found that out, and it's been soothing to me ever since. At the Last Supper, Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." People have gotten up here and shared many different ways they've remembered God, whether by skiing black runs or interacting with hospital patients. For me, one of these ways is through music. So, because I'm not brave enough to sing it for you, if you want to try a new way of remembering God today or this week, can I suggest you have a listen to Make You Feel My Love? And maybe it'll feel different, maybe it'll hit different, knowing it was probably written for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Is it feedbacky or is it just me? It's all right. All right. Paper. All right, I'm just going to carry this. I'm Chin, for those of you who don't know me. And as Phil has pointed out, we are in the middle of our sermon series, The Greatest Story Ever Told. And if you've been tracking along with us over the last couple of weeks, we have been starting to get into the more nitty-gritty type detailed things of the Bible, even though it's still scratching the tip of the iceberg type thing, right? Kai began with the whole Genesis 1 to 11 story and, getting us to try to expand our mind a little bit with a bit of science and a bit of origin story from the indigenous culture. And Kathleen, who I can't see, but Kathleen with her handouts as she spoke about the Torah last week and the importance of symbols and structure and, the amount of chaos and waters and high mountains and valleys and all that kind of stuff. I have been tasked with the topic of the monarchy. Yes. And if you know anything about the Bible, the monarchy is a gigantic topic. It's a very fascinating topic, but it is also enormous because it is so important from not only for the shaping of the Israelites with their identity and what they are like as people group, but it also is vital with the whole shaping and the narrative of the Bible itself. And there are 1,000,001 different rabbit holes I could disappear into. And if you are like me, you identify as an Enneagram 9, you would know that is terrible because it just led to so much procrastination. It was unbelievable. They just sat there, just go, oh, okay, let's just chase this rabbit hole. And it got really frustrating at different points. And then there was one point where I was sitting at the dining table, just staring at the screen for 10 minutes, doing nothing. And my 13-year-old daughter, Natalia, she was like, "Dad, why don't you just use ChatGPT?" And I was like, "No, Natalia Ting, I will not use ChatGPT, right? Because that is cheating." It's like, "No, let me show you." What should I type? Long essay, monarchy, Israel. And 2 minutes, or even less. There was a 2,000-word essay on the monarchy of Israel. And I was like, really? I didn't read it. Because, principle, right? You can't just read that stuff. And I also chose not to read it because I would be completely demoralized at the fact that AI came out with something in 2 minutes where I took a hell of a lot longer to get to. But anyways, let's move on to the non-ChatGPT version of this sermon, right? And I am going to just start off with a bit of an overview with regards to like the timeline and the events pertaining to the monarchy. And I'm basing this largely on 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, along with some dates, and that very clever historians out there have given us they have landed on to give us some sort of chronology for it, right? But before that, before Israel was a monarchy, they were largely a confederation of 12 tribes as they begin to settle in the land of Canaan. There was no clear leader. There were 12 tribes. God will occasionally raise up a judge to help deliver Israelites from their enemies. And judge is not like judge as we know it in the court of law type thing, but judge is more like a military leader type thing, right? So I know I'm overgeneralizing here, but it kind of always, it had a pattern of like the Israelites would do something to basically annoy God, disobey him, whatever. Then they will come under strife with one of the enemies, typically the Philistines. They will cry out to God. God will raise a judge, Gideon, Deborah, Samson, and then the people will be delivered. So by and large, that's how judges went. But the very last verse in Judges, in chapter 21 and verse 25, it reads, "In those days, there were no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes," which sort of gave you an impression that it was basically anarchy. Everyone just did whatever the hell they wanted to. We are then introduced to a woman by the name of Hannah, who would be Samuel's mom. And the critical detail with Hannah is that she was barren before she gave birth to Samuel. And if you know your Bible, you would know that there is a pattern of women who have trouble conceiving before giving birth to a child, and that is always a marker for a very important event is about to take place. Look at the start of Israel as a nation, Abraham and Sarah. Sarah was barren until she was 90, then she gave birth to Isaac. And Isaac and Rebekah was barren until she gave birth to Esau and Jacob. And then we go all the way to the New Testament where you got Elizabeth, who was barren until she gave birth to John the Baptist, who paved the way for Jesus, right? So Samuel was born of Hannah, who was barren. So this is a critical juncture in the entire history of Israel, because this is right at that point where they were about to become a monarchy. You can go on to the next slide. That would be sick. Of sorts. Yeah, anyways. Now, with regards to Samuel, not only is he the very last judge, he's also the prophet who will go on to anoint the first two kings of Israel, King David and King Saul. I was listening to a podcast with Pete Enns, and he was saying that he made this point that essentially Samuel was the king maker. So that was the significance over here. And that only really came about, though, because Samuel had two kids, two of his sons, and they were like very dodgy and corrupt. And the people of Israel was like, nah, stuff them. We don't want them to rule over us or be our leader. We want a king like other nations. Samuel, and actually God for that matter, was none too pleased. Were very reluctant with it, but in the end they relented. I mean, I'll come back to that in a minute. But from there, Israel was a monarchy for like 2 generations, from King Saul to King David to King Solomon. Although there's this tiny little period at the start of King David's reign where it wasn't a united monarchy, where we have King Ishbaal, who was Saul's son, who was king for a very small period at the start of King David's reign. And the only reason I brought this up because King David was king of Judah for that two-year period-ish. And that border between the north and the south of the kingdom, which we will see later on, you see it first over here. Just a geeky fact. So, they were the United Monarchy. It lasted a period of, like I said, 1050 to 931-ish. So, really only about 120 odd years before it all kind of came crashing down at the death of King Solomon, when King Solomon passed away in 1931 BCE. The nation was then split into two separate kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel had 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom had the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Now, the reason for the split was also twofold, according to the books of Kings. It was God having a very dim view of King Solomon's essentially apostasy by creating all these high places for the worship of foreign gods, especially for his foreign wives, and also Rehoboam, who is his son, being basically he was a jerk, right? But after King Solomon died, the 10 tribes who would then become the northern kingdom, they're like, hey, Rehoboam, your dad was not very nice to us. Just, back off a little bit. Give us a bit of, don't make us work so hard. We'll be your servant forever. And if you want to read, 1 Kings 12, and Rehoboam's awesome response, awesome, I say, and possibly because it's funny as hell. It's essentially comparing his male anatomy to his dad's and just essentially saying like he's got, honestly, read it. It's cool. But just like, wow, trash talk in the ancient times. That's sick. But yeah, Rehoboam, so basically the 10 tribes like, you know what, get bent. I'm not going to deal with this. So they split into the 2 kingdoms. Now, if we can flick onto the next slide, just do a bit of a comparison between the 2 kingdoms. Again, like I said, the northern kingdoms is called the Kingdom of Israel. There are 19 or 20 kings, depending on how you counted it. And it's, again, like I said, the 10 tribes, with the first king being Jeroboam. Now, they went through a grand total of 9 dynasties over the space of 200 years. So what happened was, in that time, there was turmoil left, right, and center. Like, there was like political killings, assassinations, military coups, you name it. They pretty much went through everything, which is why they went through the kings in a far greater rate than, as we will see later, the king of Judah. They were eventually conquered by the Assyrians at 722 BCE, and after they were conquered, they never came back from exile. Whereas the king of Judah, or kingdom of Judah, there are 19 kings and 1 queen, whose name was Athaliah. I think that's how you pronounce it. Like I said, 2 tribes. The first king is Jeroboam, all the way to the end. I should know the last king, but I can't remember now. But after the northern kingdom went into exile, they had another 130 odd years before they, in turn, went to exile when the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar that came and took over and basically ravaged Jerusalem. Now they would come back from exile after the Persians overthrew the Babylonians in 538 BCE. And after maybe a couple of 100 years, the Greeks would overthrow the Persians. And then they would be under the rule of the Greeks. And it is here that the Hebrew Bible got translated to Greek, and that's where we get the Septuagint. Now, if you were in the shoes of ancient Israelites, what are you to make of all of this? I mean, if we use one of Kathleen's analogy last week, especially when we look at the mountaintop type experience, this was meant to be Israelites and their peak, right? This is like, hey, we have our own kingdom now. We can mix it with some of these other kingdoms around the place, like the Persians, the Egyptians, and whatnot. We can mess with the big boys now, right? But as we just saw, it lasted, 2 generations of unity before it split into 2 kingdoms. And then within the 2 kingdoms, one lasted a couple 100 years, and then they disappear off essentially the face of the earth. And the other kingdom, the kingdom of the south, lasted another 130 odd years, and before they went into exile. So realistically speaking, I don't think we can see in any other way other than it's essentially a failed monarchy, right? But the beauty about the Bible is that, and the wonderful thing about the Bible, it gives us two separate narratives of how to read this. You got the books of Samuel and Kings as one narrative, and you got the books of Chronicles as the other narrative. And if you don't really pay attention, you just think that they're essentially saying the same thing. But when you do pay attention, you realize that no, they're actually not. They're actually telling completely different stories. Which is one of those things that I've really come to appreciate the Bible, especially over the last few years, is that it is multi-vocalic. That when you look at certain events that are mentioned multiple times in the Bible, they don't necessarily all marry up logically as we know it. As a matter of fact, sometimes they flat out contradict each other, right? But that's, a lot of times, it's largely due to the authors and the editors that puts the Bible together, choosing to leave all these different voices and different traditions to make sure that we get a fuller picture of the Bible. I mean, let's go back to the very start of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2. They are not the same creation story, right? They really have to be viewed as two separate traditions. You look in Exodus and Leviticus, and then you compare it to Deuteronomy. Yes, they say a lot of the same thing, but there's also some differences there. When you look at King David and King Solomon, how they are presented, as you will see later, in the books of Samuel and Kings versus Chronicles, again, very, very different. And that's before we even get to the Gospels. We have 4 Gospels. And they don't, again, sometimes it marries up, sometimes it doesn't. And they all paint different pictures of Jesus as we know it. Right? So rather than trying to reconcile everything and trying to make everything match up really nicely, and it's really trying to fit, a square peg into a round hole. We should really celebrate the differences. We should really look at them and say, hey, they are presenting different voices, and these voices are critical for painting the Bible and giving us a story in a much better, in a much more complete light. Now let's get back to Samuel and Kings, and compare it to the book of Chronicles. Now, the differences between the two, it's largely attributed to when they were written, and by extension, who the target audience is. And I think in this case, the English Bible, as we know, actually does Chronicles a massive disservice. Because if you know the English Bible as it is arranged, you got Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, for some reason. And then you got 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles. They're all back to back to back. And by the time you have slogged your way through the Samuel and Kings books and gone through, and try not to be confused with all the J and A names, because literally, there's only a handful of names that doesn't start with J and A. And sometimes there are different kings and both kingdoms with the same name as well. And just come on, man. Just really? By the time you do that, and then you get to Chronicles, and if you don't read Chronicles and you kind of go, wait, there's 9 chapters of genealogy right at the start. I'm supposed to read all this again? And it's no. So I think by putting it back to back, I think for most people, I know it's for me anyways, you just completely skip past Chronicles and go, hey, saying the same thing. Why am I reading this, right? But I think when you look at how the Jewish and the Hebrew Bible puts their Bible together, I think that's far more helpful, because if you look at this next slide, the Hebrew Bible is separated into 3 broad groups. You got the Torah, you got the prophets, you got the writings. And the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then you got the prophets, where you have the books of Samuel and Kings, which are grouped with Joshua and Judges. And then you get to the writings, and right at the end of the writings and at the end of the Hebrew Bible, you get Chronicles. And also, important to note that Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, they are all to be viewed as one book because they were originally one book. But unfortunately, when they got translated into Greek in the Septuagint, the book just got too massive, which is why they split it into two separate groups. But you shouldn't view it as two separate groups. It is one big group. And by putting it in two completely different places, I think it helps because you're like, okay, they're not saying the same thing. Now, Samuel and Kings, they were written when Israelites were in exile, just after the Babylonians, according to scholars, after the Babylonians have overthrown Jerusalem, and the Babylonians have conquered Jerusalem, so to speak. Whereas Chronicles, that was written about 200 years later. So more than likely at the end of the Persian reign, maybe at the start of the Greek reign. And because they are in two separate times, the people are asking two separate questions. Now, in the books of Samuel and Kings, they were trying to answer the question. If you go to the next slide. The people were more than likely asking, why are we in exile? Now, the answer to that, which will actually take like 2 sermons or something like that, but in short, Samuel and Kings are essentially saying that it is God's punishment for all the evil that the kings have done, which largely reflects a bit of the theology at the time that is based on Deuteronomy. And if you know Deuteronomy, there's a lot of covenant. They have a very strong covenant language, and there's real consequences for disobedience. Samuel and Kings, they portray the kings, especially the northern kings. Every single one of the kings in the north were evil, like literally every one of them. And obviously the most evil is Ahab and Jezebel, and that's where I get the Elijah story. Whereas in the south, even though there were 8 good kings, but by and large, they were also evil. And King Manasseh, which I probably pronouncing it wrong, but King Manasseh was so evil that God could not overlook his deeds, and therefore had to punish it, and the punishment was exile. Now, if you want to go a bit deeper, can I recommend you look up this thing called, it's a mouthful, Deuteronomistic history. All right? It's for the geeks out there. Now, as for Chronicles being written very much later, they're asking a completely different question because they have returned from exile. They have rebuilt the temple. And the question they're more than likely asking at the time is, where to from here? Is God still with us? And for the most part, the chronicler is trying to answer, yes, God is very much with you, with us. That despite how things may look, despite the fact that the Davidic line is all but broken because there is no king on the throne of Israel, God is still with us because it is God's throne and it is His kingdom, and there is the hope, the future hope, the future messianic hope. And I know I mentioned earlier that First Chronicles, it starts with that 9 chapters of genealogy, right? Again, if you want to, read it, if you like names. But I just want to point out a fact. Right at the start of the genealogy, it starts off with Adam, which apparently is just about the only place in the Old Testament that you find Adam being mentioned outside of Genesis. And the chronicler is as if it's saying, God is with us right from the very start. Read through 9 chapters of genealogy. He is with us all the way through, right here, right now. And he will continue to be with us as we go forward. And the other thing to note as well, as I mentioned earlier, is how the chronicler presents David and Solomon as compared to how Kings and Samuel presents David and Solomon. Now, if you read Samuel and Kings, you would know that in David's reign, the story of Bathsheba is a critical moment in the book, in David's life, because it is from that moment that things essentially start to go pear-shaped, right? What does Chronicles do with that story? They take it out completely. It is not even in Chronicles. In the books of Samuel and Kings, David had essentially nothing to do with the building of the temple. He apparently wanted to, and then God said, no, that's for your son. And David's like, fine, I will just leave it at that. In Chronicles, David did everything but built the temple. Like, he essentially gathered all the bits and pieces and everything like that, and there was like 5 chapters of him essentially preparing for the building of the temple so that he can just give it all to Solomon, say, here, boy, you build it now, so. And that's done for us to have a picture of David as this idealized David. And it is this picture of this idealized David that the chronicles trying to say, hey, the future king, that's how he's going to look like. Let me refer to my paper notes. Yeah. And look, that's part of the beauty of the Bible as a whole, and especially when you look at Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. They are not there to present to you the most factually correct or historically correct versions of events as we know it, as we like in the West to know it. They're there to tell you a story. It's funny how we always come back to this power of storytelling, right? And not only are the books of Samuel and Kings trying to answer the question of why are we in exile, they are also they're also exploring the human condition and the human propensity to be seduced by power and ultimately be corrupted by power and start going down the track of empire building. Now, when we go to 1 Samuel 8, God's warning to the Israelites before they actually were a monarchy was all essentially warnings about empire building. Like, just look up 1 Samuel 8. And the warnings were there because literally 2 generations later in the life and the reign of King Solomon, it came to pass. King Solomon's empire, King Solomon's reign was essentially an empire, the start of the empire. And they, having been brought out of Egypt, have become the new Egypt. So Samuel and Kings really paints quite a bleak picture of things. But when you get to the Chronicles, they paint a far more hopeful picture. A picture of this messianic king that is to come. And despite what it looks like, the Davidic covenant is not broken, but is well and truly alive. And again, when you look at the Hebrew Bible being right and Chronicles being right at the end, it ties in really, really nicely, in my opinion, with the start of the New Testament, where we have the Gospel of Matthew. Because the Gospel of Matthew is written with primarily Jews in mind, and the Gospel of Matthew starts off with another genealogy, not 9 chapters of it, but another genealogy, and the genealogy ties Jesus in with this line of David. And the kingdom motif is strong in Matthew. Like, the word kingdom is mentioned well over 30 times in the entire book. And in the life of Jesus, we get the ultimate realization of what the messianic hope, what the kingdom of heaven, of God looks like, which is a counter-narrative to the dominant story of empire. That in the life of Jesus, we are invited into this counter-narrative to be part of the kingdom that is not built on power, on might, on wealth, but an upside-down kingdom that's built on peace, on sacrificial and enemy love, on standing in solidarity with the marginalized and the other. I mean, look, honestly, I can go on and on and on, but I think I'll start landing the plane right now. If you can, I highly recommend that you go through the books of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. And if you're geeky like me, it's actually quite fun to try to pick out all the major differences between those books. And even within Samuel and Kings, try to pick out the different traditions within those books, because there are quite a few things that, again, they don't marry up quite nicely. But it does need to come with a bit of a trigger warning that those books are, especially Samuel and Kings, are violent as anything. And not just in the blood and gore sense. There's really an uncomfortable amount of sexual violence there. Like the Bathsheba story, really. That particular scene of David and Bathsheba, really, it is a rape scene. So be warned. And on a personal note, as much as we are going through the Bible now and we're trying to present to you as it is the greatest story ever told, and it is, I think we also need to recognize that the Bible is a source of pain for some of you here. And it has been used in ways that are coercive, manipulative, and even abusively. And if you struggle to read the Bible, don't read the Bible. I went through a period of maybe 5+ years where I couldn't read the Bible. Not because it was used on me in an abusive manner or anything like that, but because there was a way that I was brought up to read the Bible, and it's the only way that I was taught to read. And I was taught to read it that if I read it in any other way, that would be essentially like, that would be very wrong, and I would burn in hell or something like that. And when I started to try initially to read the Bible and look at the different theologies out there, I don't know, there was an enormous amount of guilt and shame that came with it. And I just had to completely step away from it until I basically reconciled with that. So if you don't read the Bible, it's okay. There's plenty of books out there. There's plenty of podcasts you can listen to. And can I recommend poetry? It's awesome as well. And I trust that here at Westcity, we're more than happy to walk along with you on this journey, wherever you may be on your faith journey. If I can get the musicians and the people serving communion to come up.
How good was that message? Thank you so much for joining us. Each week at Westcity, we say a benediction together. We do this because we believe that the purpose of the church is to be a caring community for the world, and that as we go and serve others, we enter into Christ's work of welcome, restoration, and healing, both for us and others. We believe that in doing so, we get to see and encounter Christ. So let's say the benediction together. we come together as the church to be reminded of the go of Christ. So we will go out and feed the hungry, go out and clothe the naked, go out and fight for justice, go out and end oppression, go out and proclaim anew the old story, go out and associate with those who don't look like us, think like us, act like us, and don't even like us. And we'll do it all in the name of the one who sent us.